Hello, everyone. I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
What makes a great leader? Is it genetic, or can you learn leadership skills? Join Tom Fox and Richard Lummis in this podcast, where they consider leadership from a wide variety of perspectives: academic, behavioral science, history, popular culture, the movies, and much more. You'll learn about specific tactics and strategies that you can bring to your own leadership toolkit. 12 O'Clock High is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, this is Richard Lummis, and I'm here with Tom Fox for another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. In these discussions, we draw what we hope are interesting examples from our own experiences, history, business, literature, and politics to examine what constitutes good leadership and extract lessons we can use to improve our own leadership skills. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
We're continuing our series on presidents today with the second of 5 podcasts covering Theodore Roosevelt. Our previous episode dealt with his early life, from his birth through his career as a rancher and cowboy, which ended abruptly with the blizzards of 1887 and his remarriage. Today we'll be discussing his life and political career up until the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. One of the first things he did when he came back was run for mayor of New York City, and that was actually in 1886. And he lost that election, mainly because a socialist named Henry George was in the lead, and so the Republican bosses ordered their voters to vote for the Democratic machine candidate rather than Roosevelt. He was pretty bitter about that, and apparently didn't like to talk about it much in his later life. After that, he was appointed to the Civil Service Commission with fellow commissioners Charles Lyman and Hugh Thompson. Benjamin Harrison's cabinet was engaged in the usual spoil system politics of the time, and the Civil Service Commission was generally regarded as sort of a sinecure and powerless. The Pendleton Act of 1883 had guaranteed that a quarter of federal jobs would be based on qualifications, and the rest were going to be allocated according to patronage. The commission had very limited powers to investigate, and even if they uncovered something, they could only recommend prosecution to the cabinet officer who oversaw the relevant department. Roosevelt's main antagonist throughout his term on the Civil Service Commission was a man named John Wanamaker, who was Postmaster General. And at the time, the post office was probably the largest source of federal patronage jobs. And Roosevelt was not appointed for 6 weeks after Harrison took office, and Wanamaker used that time pretty well to distribute patronage jobs to loyal underlings. Roosevelt here, I think, showed his genius for publicity. He showed this throughout his career. But although his post was relatively impotent, he decided to go through a series of public hearings, first in New York City, where he's guaranteed favorable media coverage, and then in Indianapolis and Milwaukee. In Milwaukee in particular, there was a scheme to falsify exam records in order to promote unqualified people. And one of the guys, a man named Hamilton Scheide, testified, and he'd been involved in the scheme. Roosevelt promised him protection, but Wanamaker fired him anyway. So Roosevelt got him a job in the Census Bureau. This later became a serious scandal because Scheide, of course, had perjured himself and participated in the falsification of federal records. And then Roosevelt had backed him for a job. But Roosevelt refused to apologize for it, and he said it was right because he did it. He was more or less vindicated in the court of public opinion, but it kind of shadowed him for a while. Now, Tom, here's something. About this time, he read, in the course of a single weekend, Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power on History. And I know that you have some opinions about this and its relevance to the turn of the 20th century politics. But
If there was one book that influenced this period of time, certainly from the military perspective, this was probably the book. I think there are other books that were equally important for other parts of American or even the world stage at that point. But this book really influenced Roosevelt, and when he moved to the national stage, he took many of the concepts that Mahan put forward, largely remembered today as a series of colonies for coaling stations for ships, seeing a great fleet as what led you to be a great power. And I think if you looked at Great Britain at this time period, I believe this was the height of empire. And I think one could reasonably conclude that that was a fair path to follow. The work he did in the Civil Service Commission led to him becoming New York Police Commissioner. And if I could maybe step back with that, and then with the moving to the national stage, some of the lessons are themes we see from Roosevelt, Richard. Taking the police commissioner's job may not have been as plain Jane or vanilla as the Civil Service Commission have seemed, but it certainly was not seen as a step to national prominence. And he utilized this stage to attempt to remove corruption from the New York police, make the police more efficient and responsive to the citizens of New York. His storied walking police beats in the graveyard shift was a brilliant political ploy and a brilliant PR ploy, and actually improved the police department because policemen couldn't sleep on the graveyard shift because they might actually get punched by Roosevelt. So that's sort of part of the legend, but it also points up to how hard he worked. And when he took up a cause, he took it up wholeheartedly. His reading of Thayer also points up to what I think is one of the key themes that I've learned from Roosevelt, which is lifelong learning. And we saw that in episode 1, and we see this throughout his life, his lifelong learning, and how moving to the national stage, he was able to implement that. He moved to the national stage largely because of his work on the presidential campaign of 1896, and then Henry Cabot Lodge actually sponsored him for presidency, and for the assistant Secretary of the Navy, not the Secretary of the Navy. So once again, he took a position which may not have seemed one that he would lead to such high prominence, yet he was able to take what he brought to the job with Thayer's theoretical background and expand that into a series of actions that you and I both marvel at literally 130 years later or 125 years later that he pulled off. That's not fair. He was prepared for and executed in the war with Spain in a way that certainly surprised the Spanish, and I think demonstrates that it's not simply execution, but it's planning before execution. He did execute, and his admirals executed, but the planning was in place. And I think all of that goes back to, I would take that back to Thayer. I don't know how you might feel about that, but what did you think about his performance in the early stages of the war with Spain?
Well, I mean, it was phenomenal, and as you point out, I think his reading of Thayer led him to be prepared, and it was in the run-up to the war that he really proved his worth. He had engineered Dewey's command in the Far East Squadron because there was a more senior man who should have gotten the post according to protocol, and Roosevelt just sort of lost the letter for a week or two until he was able to get Dewey appointed to the post. The actual Secretary of the Navy seemed to take all this in stride, which struck me as kind of odd, but he may have recognized what sort of talent he was dealing with. And he was apparently fairly lazy anyway. So Dewey was stationed in Hong Kong and fully coaled up. And and ready to go. And as you pointed out, the coaling stations stationed around the world and the modernization of the fleet in general was all partly due to Roosevelt's work before the war. The Battle of Manila Bay, which was the total destruction of the Spanish fleet, I'd always thought was sort of the end of the Philippine campaign, but it wasn't. There was a land campaign that involved the capture of Manila. And in August, the Spaniards surrendered to the Americans, which was a betrayal of the Philippine revolutionaries and caused us a great deal of trouble subsequently. But I guess it was mainly in the Pacific that the Navy took the lead role.
And then we moved to Roosevelt resigning his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to organize the Rough Riders. And this is obviously one of the legendary tales of Teddy Roosevelt, how he organized this himself. He went to I think it was the Drake Hotel in San Antonio and had a few drinks and had a few drinks, took some horses into the bar, trained his men, equipped his men, got them to Cuba largely on the strength of his personal fortune and his name and his own willpower. But when you look at and it was not simply, I think it was something that he aspired to in his life, to be a military commander. I won't say he was the best military commander on the ground, but he did lead from the front. And that's something that another theme throughout his life. And he put himself with his men and did comport himself with honor in the land campaign and certainly with the Rough Riders.
To back up a little bit, I think one of the striking things to me was there were 23,000 applications for a little over 1,000 spots in the Rough Riders. And Roosevelt was actually only the lieutenant colonel. Leonard Wood was the original colonel. But I think that shows his incredible popularity, which is something else we see throughout his career as a national politician, is that people just loved and admired him. And I think part of that was his just superhuman energy. But he certainly had just a level of charisma that was incredible. The actual land campaign, was fairly brief. The head was a 300-pound veteran general named Rufus Shafter, and Roosevelt said, "Not since the campaign of Crassus against the Parthians has there been so criminally incompetent a general as Shafter." The Spanish plan was basically to hold out until yellow fever and dysentery had killed off the Americans, which would have worked, except for the fact that, thanks at least in part to the energy of Roosevelt and Wood, the campaign was over very briefly. A couple of other little incidents happened. They were short of food, and so he found out that there were 1,100 pounds of beans in a ship off the coast, and he went to requisition them and was told they were only for officers. And he said that his officers could easily eat 1,100 pounds of beans. He showed incredible courage. I think kind of overlooked that, but he actually did lead from the front, and it's astonishing he wasn't killed. He was mounted for the charge up Kettle Hill. The San Juan Hill was the second objective of the day. But it was remarkable, the courage he showed under fire. Here again, we had another problematic issue where the Spaniards would surrender to the Americans rather than to the Cubans, causing hard feelings all around. After the Battle of San Juan, the troops were falling ill due to yellow fever and dysentery. And so the officers petitioned to be removed from Cuba after 7 weeks. None of the regular Army officers wanted to sign the letter, so Roosevelt signed the letter demanding that they be withdrawn and somehow managed to get it published before the commanding general even received it. But so the troops were withdrawn after only 7 weeks. But that really set a fire under his national prominence and led almost directly to his election as governor of New York.
And so he comes back to the United States in 1898, in the same, I think in August, and is elected governor of New York in November of the same year. He holds that position for, I guess, a year and a half, up until the presidential election of 1900, which would have been the second term of William McKinley. It was interesting. There was a series of events which led to him becoming the VP on that candidacy, Richard. I think the VP died. He died in a way at a time that was so close to the election that they were able to maneuver him into becoming the vice president. Obviously, not understanding the consequences of their actions, the Republican Party, but he is now elected vice president, and some of the key leadership lessons from this phase of this life, Richard, I thought these are going to be themes that we reiterate throughout this series. But number one was when you talked about his defeat as the mayor of New York. You're right. It's not something he spoke about, nor is it really remembered as well today. But Shannon Briss, in her article that we've cited in the show notes, pick yourself up when you fall. And Roosevelt picked himself up and got Henry Cabot Lodge to help maneuver him into the Civil Service Commission and use that as a platform. From the article Leadership Hacks, find a cause. One of the things that clear themes we see throughout every one of these podcast episodes is Roosevelt would find a cause, and he would back that cause. And once he started with a cause, Katie barred the door. And then finally, his communication skills, Richard. We saw this, the beginnings of this in episode 1, but I really think you hit the nail on the head. His use of the media, his use of favorable media. I talked about the walking the beat in New York, and there may have been a tactical reason for that. There may have been a strategic reason for that as police commissioner, but there was certainly a PR reason. And he was able to communicate simply and directly by that action, and subtly or not subtly waking up sleeping police officers. Told a story, and he was able to communicate through his stories. And Doris Kearns Goodwin cited his ability to do that as a key leadership lesson. Were there any lessons from this phase of his life that particularly struck you?
I agree with those three. The pick yourself up when you fall was an interesting one because he had some personal tragedy about the same time that he joined the police commissioner board. Instead of running for mayor again, which he'd been encouraged to do, his brother Elliot, who was a raving alcoholic and a philanderer, and his wife both were wrapped up in a huge family scandal and had died. And so Roosevelt was in no position to run for mayor, but he opted to tread water and take the police commissioner job. And he turned that into, as you pointed out, a publicity springboard and established his credentials as a reformer. And oddly enough, his tenure there wasn't entirely successful, in that most of the people he tried to remove for corruption actually simply resigned with full pensions. But he was able to turn that into a win, mainly again through his shrewd use of publicity. This phase of his life was interesting. I didn't know anything about it prior to doing the research for this. I knew vaguely. I thought he'd actually been the police chief of New York City rather than serving on the police commission with other people. But it's an interesting middle act to his life, and it does also show the importance of preparedness for when opportunity strikes. I think we saw that when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, that he took advantage of a boss who was lethargic and frequently absent to implement his own policies.
I have to say, the older I get, the more I appreciate the phrase, when preparation meets opportunity, luck arises. And we see that again and again in Roosevelt's life. And it's unclear to me if he was consciously preparing, but he was preparing. And that's what really leads me to one of the themes I want our listeners to take away from this entire podcast series of constant learning. And he learned at every job. He read, as you clearly, we talked about it certainly in episode 1, and you pointed out today, but he learned and he learned and he learned, and he didn't stop learning.
Well, and he was omnivorous, which is the other thing. He didn't just read, leadership books or business books. He just read everything and synthesized it all in a way that really is remarkable. And for his reading of the sea power in history, and then his implementation of those lessons really is quite remarkable.
Well, I can't wait to see what we come up with in this presidency.
Well, up next is Vice Presidency and Presidency, and we hope you'll tune back in. For now, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox with 12 O'Clock High.
This is Tom Fox. I hope you enjoyed this part 1 of our 5-part podcast series on leadership lessons from Theodore Roosevelt. I hope you will join Richard and I through the month of July on this special series on 12 O'Clock High. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. We are also a proud member of C-Suite Radio. I hope you'll join us again. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to visiting with you next week on the leadership lessons from Theodore Roosevelt.